James here with the Oracle Outlook for the week starting November the 4th, 2019. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me for this week's video reading. So here we are in part 2 of this week's Oracle Outlook video reading. And so if you have just landed here and you haven't checked out part 1, I will be leaving a link to that video reading in the description box below. So to give you a little bit of a recap, I'm honoring the request of one of my viewers, Carmela, who went way back into time, actually 4 years ago, but back in time, and she watched a video reading that I did in 2015. And at the time when I was doing those weekly video readings, I was doing what I called the Lenormand Tarot Tag Team, and I was breaking them up into 2 parts. Part 1 was always the reading based on Lenormand, and then part 2 was the complementary cards from Tarot, right? And then I did them and blended them as a whole, right? But I was doing them in 2 parts. So Carmela asked me if I would be willing to do that now. So here we are revisiting the Lenormand Tarot Tag Team 4 years later. So part 1, like I said, had the Lenormand cards tell us what we needed to know about the week ahead in terms of possibilities and potentialities, right? And so now in this part, we're going to revisit that line of 5, and we're going to look at the tarot cards that are corresponding to the cards in the Lenormand, right? And so the deck that's going to be assisting me in this part is the Smith-Waite Tarot, and it is published by US Game Systems Incorporated. And so now that I've set things up, let's get back to the table and take a look at what Tarot has to say to complement the Lenormand about the week ahead. And here we are with the cards on the table, and what I've done is I've taken the cards that are represented in the card inserts from the Lenormand deck, and I've taken them from a tarot deck and laid them out. So going from left to right, we have the 8 of Cups, which is the card in the Moon, 7 of Wands, which is in the Mice, 6 of Wands, which is in the Cross, Ace of Cups, which is in the Gentleman card, and rounding out the line we have the Page of Pentacles, which is in the Scythe card. So what I like to do when I'm looking at a line of cards is I like to see what suits repeat, and here we have 2 cards from the suit of cups. We have the 8 of Cups and the Ace of Cups, so we have 2 cards from the suit of cups. So that would tell us there's a connection to either feelings or emotions or relationships, right? Those aspects are playing a part in the overall situation. So that could be a relationship, not necessarily romantic, but it could just be relationships of any kind. For me, the suit of cups can represent the ability to relate to other people, and that doesn't necessarily mean romantically, right? Even though we did have the possibility of a romantic scenario played out in the Lenormand card, so we could keep that in mind as well. But it could also suggest that there's an emotional undercurrent to the situation, right? And then we have 2 cards from the suit of Wands. So Wands can represent work or business or some sort of enterprise. So there may be some relationship that may be centered on or revolving around a working situation, right? In the metaphoric sense, then this could be work or effort needing to be put into maybe something having to do with a relationship, and that could be romantic or otherwise, right? It could also be that there may be some action needed to be taken, because for me the suit of Wands can represent intention, but also with intention, action, right? And if we go back to the idea presented in the Lenormand cards with a man maybe facing a shift in his religious path or his spiritual path, then the Wands could represent inspiration, right? And there may be action that comes as a result of the inspiration. And then, don't want to leave it out, then the suit of Pentacles here for me can usually represent material matters. So this could be something having to do with a physical experience, and usually the things that make up this domain would be, money. And that would make sense if we go with the idea that there are two cards from the suit of wands. Here we have work and business, and here we may have something having to do with money. This could also be career and physical well-being, and those are all aspects that were touched on in the previous portion of this reading with the Lenormand cards, right? Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll read the cards exactly the way that we did it with the Lenormand card. So I'll start with the middle card as the focus. So here we have the Six of Wands. So the first thing for me as the focus, this would match what was discussed with the Moon card in the previous video, because Moon can represent, remember, career. So Wands being a work-related card would fit that. But they share a similar meaning in that here as the focus, there may be something having to do with recognition. Remember, that is a key word that is attached or associated to the Moon card. So here we have a repeated thing about focusing on some kind of recognition, right? In the working sense, this could be more meaningful work, or that in the business or working environment, recognition, is a need or factors into the situation. And now I'm going to go back to the gentleman card, because we had a clear significator card. So this could be, if it's for a man, this may be a need for recognition, either in the workplace, on the job, or that the person is searching for more meaningful work, right? And recognizing that fact, right? If we go with the idea that Cross was talking about, a difficulty or a burden, or even something centering on one's religion or spirituality, this card would represent, moving through it to the point where we experience a triumph, a victory, or success because of the wreath on the wand that the rider on the horse is holding, right? So this is about, work in which we achieve some kind of triumph, victory, or success, right? And that reminds me of what I talked about with Cross, about keeping the faith, right? If we keep the faith, we could move through that difficult period, right? And we could do so triumphantly, successfully, right? Now, if we're talking about, the other aspect of it, the spiritual aspect of it, and the person is, dealing with maybe a shift in that area, then this card would suggest a breakthrough happening with that. Like the person has some kind of breakthrough that kind of spurs him on. Because let's not overlook the fact that the man is on a horse, and that's a symbol of progression and forward movement. And if we lay the card down, going with that in mind, we have a progression or moving away from the energy of the Seven of Wands and toward the energy of the Ace of Cups. So we'll get to that in a moment, because that is significant, right? We're having a clear signal here that there is some sort of shift or change, right? So now let's start by looking at the Seven of Wands, because what I did was with the Lenormand cards, once I looked at the middle card, I looked at the cards immediately flanking Cross, right? So we're going to do the same thing here. So on the left of Six of Wands, we have Seven of Wands, right? So the first thing I will say here, going again with Moon being about career and vocation, one of my chief meanings for the Seven of Wands is self-employment, right? So it could be that the person in question is self-employed, right? Specifically, I see teaching with this card. I see leadership or management with this card, because the figure is on top of a hill, right? So that could be somebody who's at the top of his field, playing with the imagery, right? So that could be somebody who's in leadership or management or a supervisory position. Whatever the work is, the person has to stay on top of things, right? But in my personal experience with this card, it can represent somebody who is a teacher or a writer or a student, right? So now if we go maybe more metaphorically with the teacher and the student aspect, in the spiritual sense, we take on the role of being the teacher. In some situations, remember, we had 2 cups talking about relationships. So in some situations or in some relationships, we are the teacher. And in some, we are the student, meaning that there is something that is to be learned in the situation, right? And then in some cases, we even take on both. We're both teaching and learning at the same time, right? So let's talk about maybe some of the lessons attached to this card. The first thing that comes to mind is that as a lesson in relationships, this card would suggest standing up for oneself. So there may be an experience this week in which we are being encouraged to be empowered, self-empowered, right? To stand up for ourselves, right? In some regard, this may be about defending our position. And I'm looking at the 6 wands that are coming at the person, or they look like they're coming at the person. So this could be dealing with people who want to come at you, so to speak. And that could be literal or metaphorical, right? In the literal sense, it would be like, maybe facing some kind of confrontation and needing, in that confrontation, needing to stand up for yourself. More metaphorically, it could just be the need to kind of maybe defend your position on something. Now, this card for me usually represents facing and overcoming challenges and adversities, right? And that would make sense with the 6 of Wands coming after it, because usually when I give that message to a client in a reading, I usually say, you're facing a challenge, but you have what it takes to overcome that challenge or that difficulty. You can face it and you will come out on top, right? And again, the following card indicates a triumph, a victory, a success, right? Now, some other aspects of this card would suggest, if we go with the idea that the 2 wands are talking about work or effort, then this card is talking about, hard work, putting your nose to the grindstone, working hard to overcome something. So it would suggest, like, if you want to get to the other side of the difficulty, coming back to cross, right, which we talked about in the previous reading, then this would be about, hard work being put into the situation, but you can overcome it. Now, sometimes this card would indicate on some level that the difficulties that we're facing aren't that big. One of my meanings for this card is small difficulties. So it could just be a matter of getting us to really examine how severe are the difficulties. Are we making more of them than they actually are, right? And if that's the case, if you're wanting to make something bigger than what it actually is, and I'm going to go back to mice, I'm going to move this card over. Mice are little creatures, little things. This could be petty irritations and annoyances, right? And if that's the case, why are we making more of them than they actually are? And then the 7 on this card is about self-awareness, introspection. So you ask yourself, what do you get out of magnifying something that really isn't that big? But again, the 7 of Wands represents facing and overcoming challenges and adversities. It represents standing up for oneself. If it's about working on something, staying on top of things. And self-employment with the slant on specifically either a teacher or a writer. So that is the 7 of Wands. And if we go with the idea here, we're moving away. Now, if this is a challenge, facing a challenge or adversity, we're moving away from that, right? With the 6 of Wands, what are we moving toward? We're moving towards the Ace of Cups. So now let's take a look at that next. So here we have the Ace of Cups. And the Ace of Cups typically can represent the beginning stage of a relationship, right? Because the Ace can represent the beginning of something, something new, something starting out, something that has potential. And then Cups represents relationships, right? So here we have you know, the beginning or the start of a new relationship. And that would make sense possibly with this idea about a man facing a split, a separation, right? Going with the idea of move the card over. So remember we had gentleman who was facing scythe, right? And that may be the thing that sets the stage for a new relationship, right? Now, if we go with the clearly spiritual imagery of this card, then this could be, and this is where we bring cross in. This would be about, you know, one's spirituality, maybe one's religious path, that kind of thing, because the imagery to me implies, you know, communion. I see the cup as a communion cup with the dove descending with a communion wafer in its beak or in its bill, right? And that would bring the more religious aspect of cross back into play, right? Because that's a very kind of religious tradition, right? Taking communion, right? And so as I'm saying that, there may be issues with somebody regarding communion. If you come from a very traditional background, there may be something that you're going through that may get you to kind of have to consider about receiving communion. I'm seeing in my head the idea about not being able to receive communion based on some kind of experience, right? That kind of counters or goes against what one has been taught, you know, in religious traditions, right? In a spiritual sense, and this is about having communion with spirit. And then you get to decide when you're following a more spiritual path what that would look like. But one of the things that you're maybe being encouraged is to, you know, tap into spirit more. And then, of course, this card can represent the beginning stage of new feelings or emotions, and some of those could represent happiness and abundance, right? If you go with the idea that the cup is overflowing, right? That's a signal of abundance. If someone is creating an experience where they get to move into more meaningful work, then this would represent something that you just love to do. Your whole heart is in it. So if there is a career change or shift, it may be prompting you to consider, at this point in my life, at this stage in my life, what would I love to do? Right? If this is talking about one's vocation, remember Moon was talking about vocation, and that was purpose, calling, you know, life mission. Then this card is talking about, again, with the idea of what would you love to do, but also finding an outlet, right? We have the water coming from the cup in streams, right? So that could be, you know, finding the right and perfect outlet, or that there's multiple outlets for you to be able to work in whatever you believe to be your calling, your mission, or your purpose. Now, another meaning or aspect of this card for me is that the Suit of Cups can represent domestic affairs. So here we have something having to do with maybe home, because the Ace of Cups for me can represent home and family, and so that we may have an issue that's either family related or it's an issue close to home. So it could be something home related, like I said, or an issue close to home, having to do with either family or a family member. And then the last thing I will say is that for me, the Suit of Cups can also represent healing. So this could be the beginning of healing, and that would fit with the scenario that we talked about in the Lenormand line with Scythe representing surgery, right? So if somebody is facing surgery, then this could be the beginning of the healing process. Right, so those are some of the things that I would attribute to the Ace of Cups. But this is positive. I always tend to look at the Ace of Cups as the second best card in the deck. For me, when I work with tarot, I consider it to be the second best card, followed by the Sun. The Sun is the first card that I always talk about being the best card in the deck, and then this is a close second, right? But again, we have a wonderful thing. We're moving from a possible challenging experience, Seven of Wands, and we're moving through it to get to the other side, to the Ace of Cups, and we're going to do it successfully or triumphantly or experience some kind of breakthrough. And as a result of that, it opens the door for a new period of emotional satisfaction, right? Going with the idea about feelings. Or for the person going through a shift, there may be something that is going to be learned that they put to work, and they experience something new on a spiritual level. Because again, this could represent the beginning stage or something new in one's emotional life or spiritual life. Okay, so now let's move from the inner cards to the outer cards. So the card on the far left, we have, opening the line up, we have the Eight of Cups. And here we have a situation by the imagery. Again, we have another travel card. So this could be travel in the literal sense or travel in the metaphorical sense, right? But here we have a departure. When this card comes up for me, it usually represents moving on, right? We're moving on from the past, right? We look at the cups on the card, and the person who's walking away from the cups has taken them and gotten things in order, right? So what do we need to get metaphorically in order so we can move on? This card clearly comes up when there's a need to move on from whatever we deem to be an unhealthy situation or experience, right? I tend to look at this as something toxic. I hear the old Britney Spears song, I should say, excuse me, in my head, toxic. So usually this could represent, moving on from, toxic people, toxic conditions, a toxic environment, and toxic really just means something that's unhealthy, right? And so sometimes this card would suggest, moving on by oneself, right? And again, that would bring in the aspect possibly that we talked about with Lenormand about somebody, going through a difficult time, maybe regarding a split, separation, or even a divorce, right? So this would be moving on. And the person has to realize, I'm moving on because it wasn't healthy, right? That's if you are empowering yourself to move on. Now, if you're the one who's being left behind, then this card would suggest, how do you deal with the feelings of being left behind? That's usually about abandonment issues. How do you feel about being the one who's been left? So there's two ways of looking at that, right? And either way, the following card is about, coming to a place of empowerment, right? And for the person who may have gotten left behind, it could be, how can you empower yourself to kind of pick yourself up and move on? Now, if we go with the idea that we were talking about, spirituality, and a change or a shift in that, then this card would suggest that somebody's on a path or on a journey because they are searching for meaning. This card for me usually represents the search for meaning. And if it's a spiritual search, this card would suggest that you're doing it on your own. It's a solo journey, right? It's for you and you alone, right? But there's a search for meaning possibly here. And then that would make sense with the Seven of Wands following it, because remember, the Seven of Wands is about, teaching, right? So you may find yourself moving into a new space where you maybe are encountering a teacher, or that there's some sort of teachings that you could put to work to help you move through this challenge of searching for meaning, right? But again, the Eight of Cups usually represents a departure. It represents a journey. It represents moving on from something that was unhealthy or a situation in which you felt like you've had enough of it. Because I'm hearing the old disco song, and yes, I did say disco. I'm hearing the disco song by Donna Summer and Barbara Streisand, Enough is Enough. So this could be like somebody who has just gotten to the place where they're saying enough is enough. Now, the interesting thing I will note as I put the card down is that both the Moon and the Eight of Cups share this in common. Well, the Eight of Cups also has a moon on the card. with that in mind, both of these cards can represent a full lunar cycle, which represents a month in time, right? So I'm saying that because a month ago may be playing or factoring into the situation. Now that would make sense if we talked about the gentleman and all the cards to the left of the gentleman could represent the past. So this could be something that has maybe been a month in the making, so to speak, which means that there's, a carryover from maybe last month regarding this situation, or that its origin started a month ago. But there's something about a month that I keep seeing in my head, but both those cards share that in common, right? So it represents a full lunar cycle, which is a month in time. Right? Now, if I go with the idea, because I'm just being reminded of this, if I go with the idea that the upper cards, we're talking about the possibility of stress and, physical condition that is stress related or, has stress complications attached to it, or surgery, then this card here would be about going with the idea about something being toxic, about detoxification. So there may be about removing some kind of toxins or some sort of toxicity being removed or eliminated. And that would be if I take this card and kind of compare it or kind of connect it to the scythe card, right? If we do corners, right? So I'm seeing that. But again, the Ace of Cups comes up to represent, letting go of something that is no longer healthy and no longer serving and supporting us and moving on. And here's the thing about moving on. Sometimes with this card, it represents moving on and we're not necessarily clear or certain where we're going, right? Because he's walking off into what looks to me like the unknown. So we may not even have a clear sense of where we're going. We just know that we have to leave where we're at, right? So there's that. Now let's take our attention to the other side of the line, the last card. And here we have the Page of Pentacles. And so now the Page of Pentacles shares a meaning with the Seven of Wands, and it's this. This card is the Student and the Scholar card, right? So we have two cards that share a similar meaning. And for me, the overall thing could be about taking a time to consider what the lesson is in the experiences that we are faced with this week, right? And especially in the challenges, like what's the lesson in that? What is this experience here to teach me that I wouldn't learn any other way, right? So that could be in the larger spiritual metaphorical sense, in the literal sense, in the more mundane sense, right? Because again, pentacles can represent the physical and the material. There may be a nod here about a teacher, Seven of Wands, and student relationship, right? So this could be, mentoring, tutoring, becoming somebody's apprentice. I'm seeing in the spiritual sense, maybe somebody who's becoming a disciple or a devotee to a new spiritual path or experience. And that would make sense since the page is following the Ace of Cups, right? But one of the things I always talk about with the aspect of being a student here is that this card can represent valuable information being gained, but also about practical application. If you are learning something new, spiritually speaking, right? This card would suggest, how do you practically apply that to your life in a way so that you get to see the results? Going back to the center card, Six of Wands, right? You want to be able to see some sort of success. You want to be able to see some kind of triumph or victory. You want to experience some kind of breakthrough, right? But this card would come up as like, how do you practically apply what you're learning to your life so that you see that it works? Right? So now, the only other thing I will say about the Page of Pentacles is that this card can represent, news and messages This one in particular would represent valuable information, right? So I'm going to draw an additional card to see what more in that respect does the Page of Pentacles have to say about news or messages. The one other thing before I leave to do that, or I leave the card to do that, is that, you know, I'm looking at the page and the page is really focused on the pentacle in his hand or his hands, right? So this could be about what do we need to focus on? What do we need to concentrate on, right? If the Seven of Wands is about hard work, being put into a situation, working hard, having our nose to the grindstone, then this card would be about being focused, you know, putting your skill to concentrate into the situation, putting that to work for you, right? So about focus and concentration, attention to detail, maybe even. But I'm also seeing with this card, the expression in my mind is keeping your eye on the prize, right? So if you are working towards something, don't lose sight of what it is that you're working towards. Don't lose sight of the prize, especially if you're faced with difficulties or challenges or you're facing some kind of adversity. Don't lose sight of what the prize is. Keep your eye on the prize. Right? So now I'm going to put the card down. And as I'm saying, as I'm looking at this, I'm also looking at the dynamic here. We have an ace and we have a page. They both represent new stages of development, right? The ace represents a new stage or phase, and then the page represents a learning stage of development. I'm saying this, as I'm looking at the two cards here, if we talk about the scythe representing something that needs to be cut or eliminated, right? We may, you know, benefit from that. There may be something that is going to be gained in terms of value, and that would be maybe more metaphorical, you know, regarding our own physical well-being, or we're learning something that's going to be helpful regarding our physical well-being. And it could be that we're learning something and we're learning what we might need to cut out or what we might need to eliminate, right? So I'm seeing that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a moment to gather the rest of the deck, and I'm going to shuffle the cards, and I'm going to pull an additional message card. Now you may not be able to see this, but hopefully you can hear me shuffling the cards. And I'm asking regarding the Page of Pentacles. What more does the Page of Pentacles want to impart to us regarding any possible news or message? So I'm focusing on that question. And this will be a nice way to end the reading. So what I'm doing is now, because you can't see me, I'm cutting the deck. And now you may see this at the top. I'm going to spread the cards in a fan across the top. And now I'm looking for one card in the fan that's getting my attention. I'm going to pull this card and I'm going to lay it right here. So that is our news and message card. So now let's take a look at the card. And here we have, oh yes, so here we have the Ten of Pentacles. This is fantastic. Okay, first thing I will say is that the Ten of Pentacles is known as the wealth card, right? So we moved from abundance, Ace of Cups, in maybe the more emotional sense or the spiritual sense, to something maybe more tangible and in the material sense with the Ten of Pentacles, right? Because again, this is about wealth. So this could be about material abundance. So that could be financial, right? Another aspect, if we go with the idea that the Ace of Cups is talking about home and family, because I did say that, then this card could represent dealing with family influences. And this is where I'm going with this. Sometimes this card is known as the inheritance or legacy card. And so this could be dealing with family issues that have been passed down. So influences from the family. So this is usually about history, right? So dealing with things from the past and maybe needing to work through those, get over those. Because a 10 in this regard would represent some kind of transition, right? And a transition that is successful, because the 10 is also about success. Right? So there is that to consider, like what issues or influences have been passed down in the family that maybe we need to take a look at eliminating, right? If we put, because the card would go here, right? It's a message card, so the scythe card is above it. So it would be eliminating things from the past regarding our history or our family history in particular, right? And that would make sense with the card on the opposite side of the line, Eight of Cups. Remember, it's about walking away, moving on from things that are no longer healthy or no longer serving and supporting us. For some of us, it may have to do with family. Remember, I said Ace of Cups is about family and family members, right? And so we have that here with the Ten of Pentacles, right? So this could be about, something like generational. And that could even be, if we're talking about it in the physical well-being sense, right? Something health related. It could be something that, has been inherited, that gets passed down from generation to generation in a certain family dynamic. Right? So, but if we go with the idea here is about this card is about appreciation, right? Appreciation for the material things, right? Just like we get things appraised, valuable things get appraised. This could be about like we take the time this week to make some kind of appraisal, and that's just an evaluation. What do we value in life? Right, so again, this card can be about dealing with family business, family history, something that gets passed down, and that could be an influence, an issue that just gets passed down, handed down from generation to generation. How do we deal with that? How do we move beyond it in a successful way? Now, some other aspects I talked about work and business. So this could be literally a family-owned business in one regard, or somebody who is, wanting to move up the ladder in a company or corporation. Right? Remember, I talked about with the Seven of Wands about being in a leadership position or a managerial position or playing a supervisory role, right? And this could be the department or the company that that person is in. And if we go back to the spiritual aspect of the card, remember I talked about with the Ace of Cups, and I'm going to move this over slightly. The Ace of Cups was about, a new spiritual experience or a new spiritual phase. Then with the Page of Pentacles, and I'm going to take a moment to move the card over so we can have both cards present or seen. With the Page of Pentacles for me can represent a person who has the ability to contact the spirit world. Right? So this could be somebody who communicates with spirits, and so that's been a thing I've been talking about a lot these days in these readings. So this could be somebody who is a channel or a medium, right? And then the Ten of Pentacles in that regard would be about taking things to the next level, right? This would be about like ascension or moving on to the next level. This is about going higher. And so in that regard, this could be about communication with higher level beings, spiritually speaking, right? And if that's the case, then I'm going to move back. Then the other cards, Seven of Wands in particular, could be someone studying that. Somebody being tutored or mentored in that regard. And then the Eight of Cups before it could be the spiritual journey or the spiritual departure, right? Somebody is moving beyond maybe something that is considered more traditional, more mainstream, right? And maybe walking or discovering an alternate path. And the last thing I will say with that in mind, I'm looking at the pattern that the coins are in on the Ten of Coins, and for those who are familiar, they are in a pattern of the Tree of Life from Kabbalah. So I'm saying that to say this, going with the idea about moving away from something mainstream. So going with that, there may be a move from a more mainstream or traditional aspect of your religion or spirituality to something more alternative or metaphysical or esoteric, right? Going with the idea that the Kabbalah, or the study of the Kabbalah, is the more esoteric form of Judaism, right? And I will say this, you could actually also be literally, with this card, being asked to pursue Kabbalah. And so without making this terribly personal, that was one of the things that I experienced. I had a dream where I was with a person who was celebrated in the New Age movement. And I'll talk more about that if somebody wants to know. But it was somebody who was a celebrity in that. And when I say celebrity, I'm talking about the moon in Lenormand, about somebody who was well known, right? Somebody who had that kind of celebrity type status. But in a dream, I was with this person, and the person took me down a hallway or a corridor, and that's a transition. In dreams, hallways represent a transitional phase, right? Because the hallway gets you from one room in a building or a space to another, right? And then we got to a room where we sat at a table, and this person was a writer, seven of wands, right? This person was a writer and had written a book and was passing the book around for people to take a look at. And the book was titled The God of Kabbalah. And I woke up from the dream and I realized that I was being encouraged to study Kabbalah. Now, I'm no expert in it by any stretch of the imagination, but I was being encouraged to do that. So for me to say that, is I'm saying that, all of that to say, is that somebody else may be feeling the urging or the prompting or the leading to actually take up the study of Kabbalah or Kabbalah, however you want to pronounce that, right? And I'm only sharing that because that was my experience, and it's being reflected in some of the cards on the table. So somebody may be Kabbalah or Kabbalah in particular, but if not, whatever you might consider to be the more traditional or more mainstream aspects of your religion or spirituality, you may be feeling inclined to maybe explore the more metaphysical or esoteric aspects of it. And so on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end this week's Oracle Outlook. I'm James Himm Mitchell, and as I close, I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me for part 2 of this week's Lenormand and Tarot Tag Team. And as I sign off, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day, and I'm hoping that you have a very tarot-tastic week. Take care.